The wagon wheels screeched as they rolled across the cracked earth, each turn sending up small clouds of dust that clung to Lila's hair and settled in the folds of her plain dress. She sat stiffly on the back bench, her hands gripping a small cloth bundle pressed tightly against her stomach. Her eyes stayed fixed on her knees, refusing to rise toward the horizon that shimmered under the midday sun like a blade. Beside her, the driver, a thin man with sunburned cheeks and a permanent squint, didn't speak. He only grunted now and then at the mule, flicking the reins with quick, sharp snaps. As the wagon crested a final low ridge, the homestead came into view, a long, sagging house with gray, splintered boards and a narrow porch that seemed to sink into the dry earth. The roof slanted awkwardly, patched with rusted metal sheets. A few scraggly trees stood nearby, twisted into shapes that looked more like reaching hands than branches. Beyond the house stretched an endless sweep of pale dust and thorny brush. There was no sign of neighbors, no distant plumes of chimney smoke. Only heat waves and the slow crawl of wind. The driver clicked his tongue, slowing the mule. Lila's breath caught in her throat as the wagon lurched to a stop. "Down," the man said, not bothering to look at her. Lila swallowed hard and slid off the bench. Her boots hit the ground with a small puff of dust, and the heat seemed to climb up her legs instantly, coiling around her like a snake. She bent to retrieve her bundle, her fingers fumbling over the knotted cloth. A creak drew her gaze upward. The front door of the house opened slowly, revealing a tall, angular woman in a long black dress buttoned to her throat. Her hair was pinned back so tightly it looked painful, and her eyes were sharp and colorless under the shade of her bonnet. "Mrs. Carter!" The woman stepped forward, her boots silent despite the warped boards. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked down at Lila with a stare that felt like being weighed on a scale. "You're the one sent for debt payment," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, and empty of any warmth. Lila nodded quickly, her chin nearly touching her chest. Mrs. Carter's gaze slid over her from head to toe, pausing on the thinness of her arms, the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the way her shoulders curled inward like she might vanish if pressed too hard. "We have rules here," Mrs. Carter continued. "You'll learn them quickly if you want to stay alive." Lila's fingers tightened around her bundle, her knuckles turning white. The driver tossed a glance toward Mrs. Carter, then turned back to his mule without a word. With a click and a slap of the reins, he urged the animal forward. The wagon creaked away, leaving a trail of dust and a hollow quiet in its wake. Lila watched it until it shrank into the horizon, a thin, wavy line. Then she turned back to Mrs. Carter, who was already stepping back toward the door. "Bring your things and follow," she said without turning her head. Lila forced her feet to move, each step heavy as iron. As she reached the porch, she paused for a heartbeat, looking at the dark gap beyond the door, a mouth ready to swallow her whole. Inside, the air was cooler but thick with the smell of old wood, sweat, and something sour she couldn't name. The hallway was narrow, lined with crooked frames that held yellowed photographs. The floorboards groaned under her weight, each sound echoing down the dim corridor. Mrs. Carter led her to a small room at the back of the house. A narrow cot stood against the wall, a single wool blanket folded neatly at the foot. A chipped basin sat on a crooked table beside it. "This is yours," Mrs. Carter said, her voice flat. "You'll rise before the sun. Work begins at first light. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not leave the yard. And you will not, under any circumstances, approach the cellar." Lila's breath shivered out of her, her eyes dropping to the floor. She nodded once, afraid her voice would betray her if she tried to answer. Mrs. Carter stared at her for another long moment before turning sharply on her heel and disappearing down the hall, the door closing with a quiet finality that rang louder than any shout. Lila set her bundle on the cot, her hands trembling. She sank onto the edge of the thin mattress, the wool scratching at her thighs even through her dress. She looked around the small, stifling room, her chest tight, each inhale like swallowing splinters. Outside, the wind rattled a loose shutter, and somewhere beyond the wall she thought she heard a faint dragging sound, like something heavy moving underground. Lila drew her knees to her chest, pressing her forehead against them. The wagon was gone. The gate had closed. And she was here now. Lila barely slept that first night. Every time her eyes closed, the darkness behind her lids pulsed with shifting shapes. The image of Mrs. Carter's pale eyes, the dry stretch of earth beyond the fence, the sharp creak of the hallway floor. She sat curled on the cot, her forehead pressed to her knees, listening. The house breathed and shifted in the night. Boards settled, an old pipe rattled, a faint rustle traveled through the walls like a distant whisper. At dawn, a sharp knock jolted her upright. Before she could answer, the door swung open, and Mrs. Carter stood in the doorway, her black dress swallowing the dim morning light. "Up!" she ordered. Her voice cut through the small room like a blade. Lila scrambled to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. She grabbed her bundle instinctively, clutching it to her chest. "Leave it!" Mrs. Carter snapped, turning her back and stepping into the hallway. Lila dropped the bundle onto the cot, her fingers trembling, and followed. The hallway felt even narrower in the morning light, the wallpaper's faded floral patterns curling away from the wall in yellowed strips. She smelled something burning, the sharp, bitter scent of scorched coffee or porridge, drifting from the kitchen. Mrs. Carter led her to a large wooden basin set near the back door. A small, thin boy stood beside it, his head bowed, hair hanging over his eyes. His hands moved quickly as he peeled potatoes into a dented pail. "This is Samuel," Mrs. Carter said without glancing at the boy. "You don't talk to him. You don't talk at all unless I speak first." Lila nodded, her eyes dropping to the dirt floor. Mrs. Carter thrust a pile of grimy clothes into Lila's arms. "Wash these, then start on the porch steps." Lila moved to the basin, her fingers stiff from the cold morning air. She dunked the first shirt into the water, the dirt clouding around her wrists. As she scrubbed, her ears strained toward every sound, the scrape of Samuel's knife, the soft creak of Mrs. Carter's rocking chair from the other room, the distant call of a hawk slicing across the empty sky. At one point, she glanced sideways. Samuel's eyes flicked up, just for an instant, wide, dark, and full of something she couldn't name. Before she could hold his gaze, he dropped his head again and worked faster. When she finished the clothes, she carried the dripping bundle to the line strung between two crooked poles in the yard. The sun had already climbed high, burning against her shoulders. Each breath felt hot and sharp in her chest. From the porch, Mrs. Carter watched, her face expressionless. Every time Lila turned to pin another shirt, she felt the woman's stare crawl up her spine like cold water. After hanging the last piece, she moved to the porch steps. She knelt and began scrubbing, her knees grinding into the rough wood. The water turned brown almost immediately, the smell of old dirt and soap rising around her like a sour cloud. Behind her, Mrs. Carter's chair rocked slowly, the old boards groaning in rhythm. "Faster," Mrs. Carter said after a while, her voice flat. Lila's arms burned. She pushed harder, her breaths coming in quick bursts. "That's enough," Mrs. Carter finally snapped. "Fetch water for the kitchen. Don't dawdle." Lila stood shakily, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. She glanced toward the well beyond the yard. A dark circle of stone, the rope hanging limp beside it. She picked up the pail and moved across the dust-cracked yard. Each step felt heavy, her skirt dragging behind her like an extra limb. When she reached the well, she peered inside, a deep black hole that swallowed the light. As she dropped the bucket, she thought she heard something, a faint echo, not just of water but something softer, almost like a sigh. She shook her head, her hands tightening on the rope. She pulled the bucket up, the muscles in her shoulders screaming. As she turned back toward the house, she paused. Her gaze drifted to the side of the house, to a low, narrow door set into the earth, the cellar. Its wooden boards looked swollen and dark, the lock a small, blunt shape of iron. A shiver crawled across her skin. She forced herself to turn away, her heart hammering in her throat. When she stepped onto the porch with the pail, Mrs. Carter stood waiting. "Good," she said, taking the bucket. Her fingers brushed Lila's wrist, cold, dry, as though they'd never held warmth. "Eat," she ordered, jerking her chin toward a chipped bowl on the steps. Lila lowered herself slowly, her knees shaking. The bowl held a thin, grayish stew. She lifted the spoon with trembling hands, swallowing each bite like it might catch in her throat. Above her, Mrs. Carter stood still, her eyes fixed on the yard, the porch, the world beyond, as if guarding every edge. Lila forced herself to eat every drop, her stomach turning with each swallow. She set the bowl down and folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Carter didn't move, didn't speak. Lila sat there in the dry heat, her head bowed, feeling the cellar's shadow pressing against her back, even when she wasn't looking. That night, the house lay heavy and hushed under the moonlight. The air inside felt thick, as if it carried every unsaid word, every warning that had been pressed into Lila's bones since she arrived. She lay on her cot, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling where small cracks crawled like thin, crooked veins. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant groan of the wind against the walls, made her muscles flinch. She heard Mrs. Carter moving through the hallway long after the lamps were blown out. Soft, deliberate steps, the quiet authority of someone who believed she owned every breath in the house. When the footsteps finally stopped, Lila let her eyelids slip shut, though her mind refused to quiet. In her dream, she saw the cellar door open by itself. A wide black mouth yawned beneath the house, the edges slick and breathing. From its depths, she heard her own name echo back, each syllable stretched and twisted. She woke with a sharp gasp, her throat tight, her dress clinging to her with cold sweat. The moon had shifted, its pale light spilling across the floor like a silent witness. Lila rose slowly, careful to avoid the creaky spots she had memorized during the day. She moved to the small window above the basin, pressing her forehead to the glass. The yard looked endless at night, a pale sea of dust, the fence a wavering line in the distance. She saw the well, the thin rope swaying slightly in the wind. The orchard beyond it shivered in the moonlight like a living thing. Her gaze shifted to the left, to the side of the house, the cellar door. Even now, locked and still, it seemed to watch her, its swollen wood glistening in the moonlight. A soft thud somewhere below made her breath catch. She held herself still, her ears straining. Another dull thump, deeper this time, like a body shifting in a coffin. She pressed her fingers to her lips to hold in a cry. Her heart pounded so loudly she felt it echo up into her skull. The urge to run burned through her, out the window, across the yard, over the fence, but her legs refused to move. She turned and crept back to the cot, curling into the tightest ball she could manage. Her fingers dug into the blanket until her knuckles whitened. Through the thin walls, she heard Mrs. Carter's rocking chair begin its slow, rhythmic creak in the front room. Back and forth, back and forth. Lila squeezed her eyes shut. She imagined the cellar door again, the blackness beneath it, and someone, waiting for her inside. She pulled the blanket over her head, as if that thin shield could keep the darkness out. But even in that shallow, suffocating warmth, she felt it pressing against her, heavy and patient. In the rocking chair's steady creak, she heard a quiet promise. "Tomorrow you will obey. Tomorrow you will not look. Tomorrow you will be mine." She pressed her face into the pillow, fighting the sob rising in her throat, and prayed for the morning to come quickly, though she no longer knew whether dawn would mean safety or only more silent horrors waiting in the heat. Dawn broke slow and red, spilling across the yard like a thin smear of blood. Lila sat up on her cot before the first bird dared make a sound, her body stiff and cold from the night. She rubbed her eyes, but the images from her dream clung to her skin. The cellar door, the voice calling her name from the black. A soft knock jolted her fully awake. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Carter's thin figure filled the frame, her black dress swallowing what little light entered the room. "Up!" she said, her voice even and empty. Lila stood quickly, head lowered, her fingers fumbling at the hem of her dress. "Follow!" Mrs. Carter ordered. They moved down the hallway, the boards groaning under their weight. The kitchen door hung open, and the smell of scorched bread and old coffee drifted out like a warning. Samuel stood near the stove, stirring something in a small pot. His eyes stayed low, his shoulders curled inward. Mrs. Carter gestured to a bucket by the back door. "Water for the steps. You'll scrub them until I say stop." Lila nodded, taking the bucket. Its iron handle bit into her fingers as she stepped into the yard. The porch steps looked even more warped in the early light, gray wood cracked and splintered. She knelt at the bottom, the bucket's surface shivering with reflections of the pale sky. She dipped the rag and began to scrub, the water quickly turning brown. Each stroke scraped at her raw palms, reopening small cuts from the day before. Above her, Mrs. Carter settled into her rocking chair, a chipped mug in her hands. She rocked slowly, the chair creaking in a slow, steady rhythm that burrowed into Lila's spine. "Huh?" "Faster," Mrs. Carter called after a while, her voice drifting lazily over the yard. Lila's shoulders burned, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. She forced her arms to keep moving, rag sliding over the splinters, over the dark grooves that seemed to crawl deeper every time she looked away. She paused to wring out the rag, glancing toward the orchard beyond the fence. Morning mist coiled low around the trees, hiding the outer edges of the yard. For a moment she imagined slipping into that fog, her figure vanishing among the twisted trunks, swallowed by the pale hush of dawn. A sudden snap pulled her back. Mrs. Carter had stood, her mug now empty. "Enough," she said. "The well needs water drawn, then the kitchen floor." Lila pushed herself up, her legs trembling, knees aching from the hours on the hard boards. She carried the bucket to the well, her gaze sliding toward the cellar door as she passed it. The lock sat heavy and dark against the swollen wood, catching the light like an eye. She shivered, her hands tightening on the bucket handle. At the well, she dropped the pail, listening to the long echo as it splashed far below. The rope strained and jerked in her hands as she pulled, each tug carving deeper into her already raw palms. When she finally set the bucket down by the kitchen door, her arms felt like wet cloth, too heavy to lift again. Inside, Samuel avoided her gaze as he shuffled past with a tray. His eyes flicked up once, a quick, fearful glance, then dropped again to the floor. She wanted to speak, to ask if he heard the same noises at night, if he saw the same shadows. But Mrs. Carter's footsteps in the hallway swallowed the thought before it reached her lips. As she knelt to scrub the kitchen floor, she felt Mrs. Carter's eyes on her from the doorway. Lila kept her head down, her breath ragged, the floor's dirt and grease smearing over her hands. With each swipe of the rag, her mind whispered the same refrain. Not the cellar, never the cellar. Yet deep inside, a new thin thread pulled at her. A question she didn't want to form, a terrible curiosity that itched beneath her skin like a splinter. What is she hiding down there? She scrubbed harder, the question growing sharper, sinking deeper with every scrape against the boards. That afternoon, the sun turned the yard into a pale, wavering mirage. Lila moved in a slow, mechanical rhythm, scrubbing the last corner of the kitchen floor. Every joint in her fingers burned. Her palms were pink and raw, dotted with small, dark splinters. Mrs. Carter stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her sharp eyes tracking each of Lila's movements like a hawk watching a mouse. When the final board was wiped, Mrs. Carter nodded once. "Outside," she said, her voice flat. "The porch rail needs cleaning." Lila pushed herself up, legs trembling under her. She stepped into the bright yard, squinting against the sharp glare. The porch rail was thick with dust and spider webs, small dark insects scuttling away as she approached. She dipped her rag into the bucket and began again, her shoulders heavy as wet stones. A faint movement caught her eye. Samuel stood by the edge of the yard, a basket of onions in his thin arms. He paused for a moment, his gaze flicking toward her. Their eyes met, just a heartbeat, but enough for her to see it. A thin sheen of fear mixed with something else. Pity, maybe. Before she could react, he dropped his head and shuffled back toward the kitchen, vanishing behind the warped door. Lila swallowed hard, turning back to her task. As she worked her way down the rail, her eyes drifted again and again toward the side of the house. The cellar door seemed to pulse in the heat, its dark shape sunken into the ground. The heavy lock glinted when the wind shifted, and each time a shiver crawled up her spine. She heard Mrs. Carter step onto the porch behind her. The woman watched in silence, her presence heavy as an iron weight. Lila's rag slipped from her fingers, dropping to the ground. She bent to retrieve it, and as she did, her eyes caught the path leading around the house, a narrow strip of dust-lined ground between the fence and the orchard, half hidden by leaning boards. She straightened, clutching the rag to her chest. Mrs. Carter shifted forward slightly. "Finish," she snapped. Lila forced her arms to move again, but her mind pulsed with a single dangerous thought. What is down there? Later, when the sun dipped low and shadows pooled in the corners of the yard, Mrs. Carter finally dismissed her. "Room, now," she ordered. Lila retreated inside, her body aching in waves. She washed her hands at the basin, wincing as the water turned pink with blood and dirt. That night, as the moon climbed and the house settled into its usual hush, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Then, a faint sound. A thump, lower than before, almost like a heartbeat under the floorboards. She rose from the cot slowly, every nerve in her body screaming against it. She stepped into the hallway, moving like a shadow. The air felt colder here, thick with something unseen, but deeply felt. She reached the kitchen and paused. The house creaked softly around her, but there was no sign of Mrs. Carter. She crept to the back door. Beyond it, the yard was soaked in moonlight, pale and trembling. Her eyes darted to the cellar door. It looked larger in the dark, the lock a dull scar against the wood. A single thought echoed through her head, each repetition pulling her forward. Just look, just once. She crossed the yard in small, careful steps, her bare feet silent on the dust. At the cellar door, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the lock, cold and rough, and she felt her breath catch. Behind her, a sudden clatter, a sharp splintering sound like a cup smashing on the floor. She spun around, her heart crashing in her chest. The kitchen window glowed faintly, and she saw a shape move just inside. Mrs. Carter, her head tilted slightly, watching. Lila's hand fell from the lock. A wave of terror rose in her throat, choking her. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stones near the foundation. The kitchen door creaked open. Mrs. Carter stepped out onto the porch, her black dress billowing slightly in the night breeze. Without a word, she pointed toward the woodshed. Lila's legs moved before her mind could catch up. She ran across the yard, her breath ragged, and ducked inside the narrow shed. The door slammed shut behind her with a final, echoing thud. In the pitch black, she pressed her back against the wall, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Through the thin slats, she heard Mrs. Carter's slow, steady steps cross the yard. The door creak closed again. And then silence. Lila sank to the ground, hugging her knees, her forehead pressed to her arms. She knew then that the cellar was more than forbidden. It was a threat, a promise, and a trap waiting in the dark. And tonight she had come too close. Lila woke to the raw, gray hush before sunrise, curled on the dirt floor of the woodshed. Her limbs ached from the cold, her dress stiff with dust. She shifted slowly, her bones protesting every movement. Thin beams of dawn light leaked between the warped boards. Outside, the yard was still, the air heavy as if holding its breath. She pressed her forehead to her knees, trying to swallow the sharp stab of hunger twisting her stomach. Her mind drifted back to the night before. The cellar door, Mrs. Carter's silent command, the cold finality of the woodshed door slamming shut. A sudden clatter broke the quiet. She flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. The shed door swung open, flooding the cramped space with pale light. Mrs. Carter stood there, a coil of thin rope in one hand. Her eyes were colder than morning frost. "Out," she said. Lila hesitated. Mrs. Carter stepped forward sharply, her shadow swallowing Lila's small form. With one quick jerk, she grabbed Lila by the wrist and dragged her into the yard. The ground burned cold against her bare feet as she stumbled forward. Mrs. Carter led her past the porch, beyond the empty water buckets, toward the side gate. Lila saw it then, a row of small tarnished bells strung along the fence posts, each one tied to thin wires that glinted in the weak light. She froze, realization flooding her like ice water. The bells were traps, meant to catch anyone trying to slip away. Mrs. Carter shoved her roughly to the ground. Dust rose around her face, sticking to her skin and catching in her mouth. Without a word, Mrs. Carter knelt and pulled Lila's wrists together, binding them with the rope. The fibers bit into her raw skin. Lila winced, but didn't make a sound. Mrs. Carter tied the end of the rope to a heavy iron hook set deep in the ground. Then she stood, her silhouette black against the pale sky. "You will stay here," she said. "You will learn." Lila's mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a dry, strangled gasp. Mrs. Carter turned and walked back toward the house. Her boots made slow, deliberate prints in the dust, each step echoing in Lila's skull like a drumbeat. The moment the door shut behind her, the yard seemed to expand into a silent, endless prison. Lila pulled at the rope, but each tug burned deeper into her wrists. The hook refused to budge. She lay her forehead on the ground, her tears turning the dust to mud under her cheek. Hours dragged by. The sun climbed higher, searing her skin. Flies gathered at the corners of her eyes and mouth, buzzing in endless hungry circles. At some point she drifted in and out of a hot, fevered haze. She saw the cellar door in her mind again and again, its edges warping, breathing, calling. A faint creak jolted her awake. Through her bleary gaze, she saw Samuel standing at the edge of the yard, half hidden behind a barrel. His small hands clenched at his sides. Their eyes met. For a long, stretched second, they stared at each other, the world around them shrinking to a thin, fragile thread. Samuel opened his mouth as if to speak, but then snapped it shut. He turned abruptly and vanished behind the barn, leaving only the echo of his hesitation behind. Lila closed her eyes, the last of her strength draining away with the sun. By late afternoon, the door creaked open again. Mrs. Carter walked across the yard slowly, each step careful and measured. She knelt, untied the rope, and stood without a word. Lila didn't move. "Get up," Mrs. Carter ordered. Lila forced her arms to work, her body screaming in protest. She rose shakily, every joint burning, every breath an effort. Mrs. Carter pointed to the house. Inside, Lila shuffled forward, each step echoing in her skull. The cellar door loomed in her peripheral vision, a dark mouth waiting. As she reached the porch, she felt the rope burns on her wrists, throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She stepped inside, the air heavy and sharp with the scent of old wood and kerosene. In that instant she understood. The gate was never her real prison. The real cage was the cellar door, and Mrs. Carter's silent, patient hands waiting for her to fail. And though her body trembled, something small and sharp began to spark in her chest, the first flicker of defiance she hadn't dared believe she could hold. That night, Lila lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, the burns on her wrists pulsing like small, angry mouths. Her mind drifted in and out of shallow, feverish sleep, each half-dream snapping her awake with the echo of Mrs. Carter's footsteps or the imagined creak of the cellar door. At some point she heard it again, the dull, dragging noise from below the floorboards, the same low thump she had heard her first night. This time it felt closer, as if the sound had risen to the edges of her room, breathing beneath the thin wooden planks. She pressed her palms over her ears, her body curling tight. But even through her hands she heard it, a slow, dragging plea in the dark. Just before dawn, when the stars began to pale, a new noise joined the house's restless chorus, a soft tap at her door. She jolted upright, her breath stuck in her throat. "Please," a thin voice whispered. She froze. Samuel. With trembling fingers, she pushed the door open just enough to see him. He stood in the hallway, small and ghostly in the gray light, a thin scrap of paper crumpled in his fist. His eyes were wide, shiny with terror. Without a word, he thrust the paper into her hands and backed away quickly, disappearing down the hall like a startled animal. Lila closed the door, her heart battering her ribs. She unfolded the paper, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was uneven, shaky. "Don't let her take you to the cellar. No one returns." Lila's breath faltered. She read it again and again until the words blurred and swam in her vision. She pressed the note to her chest, her body rocking slightly. The cellar wasn't just a place to fear. It was an ending, a grave. She moved to the window and peered out. The yard lay quiet, the sky above it beginning to bruise into the first colors of morning. The orchard beyond the fence swayed gently in the breeze, each branch a silent beckon toward escape. But she knew now the path was lined with traps, and Mrs. Carter would hear even a heartbeat too loud. She hid the note under her thin mattress, then sat back down on the cot, her knees drawn to her chest. In the silence, she replayed Samuel's eyes, the desperate shake of his small hands. He knew what waited for her. He had seen it happen before. A new fear crept over her, deeper and colder than the bruises on her skin, the knowledge that Mrs. Carter was already choosing when to lead her down those narrow steps. Yet beneath that terror, another feeling began to stir, faint but undeniable. A small, stubborn heat pulsed in her chest, curling around the sharp edge of the note. A word began to form behind her teeth, bitter and bright. No. She didn't say it aloud, not yet. But she held it there, a single match in a room full of shadows. As the first morning light slipped across her floor, Lila pressed her palm over her heart, feeling the beat, fragile but hers. For the first time since stepping off the wagon, she felt a tiny, silent promise flicker inside her. She will not take me without a fight. The day began with a dry wind that rattled the shutters and carried fine dust into every crack of the house. Lila rose before Mrs. Carter called, her body moving on instinct despite the deep ache in her wrists and shoulders. When Mrs. Carter entered her room, she gave Lila a long, measuring stare. The woman's pale eyes slid over her face and down to her hands, as if counting the bruises she had already catalogued. "Kitchen," Mrs. Carter said finally, her voice sharp enough to split the air. "Then wash the yard buckets. After, scrub the porch." Lila nodded without meeting her eyes. She shuffled to the kitchen where Samuel stood silently at the counter peeling potatoes. His thin fingers moved quickly, his eyes fixed on the blade, but his whole body seemed tense, like a coiled wire ready to snap. For a brief moment their eyes met. Samuel's gaze darted to the floor almost instantly, but not before Lila saw the silent message there. "Be careful." She moved to the sink and began scrubbing the greasy pots. Each stroke of the rag sent a stab of pain up her arms, but she kept her face blank, her breaths slow and careful. Mrs. Carter hovered near the doorway, her presence as heavy as iron. Every few minutes she shifted, her boots scraping softly against the warped boards, her gaze darting to the hallway. When Lila finished the pots, she stepped outside to the yard. The buckets stood in a line coated with dust and grit. She bent over them, dipping her rag into the water until her fingers went numb. The cellar door loomed in the corner of her vision, its lock dark and heavy in the sun. She dared not turn her head toward it, but she felt its presence like a cold breath on her neck. Above her the porch boards groaned. Mrs. Carter stood at the edge, arms folded across her chest, her dress flaring slightly in the wind. "Faster!" she called. Lila's shoulders tensed. She scrubbed harder, her breath shallow, the rag slapping against the pails. Sweat dripped from her brow, mixing with the dust to form thin, dirty rivulets on her cheeks. When she finished the last bucket, she turned to the porch steps and began scrubbing them once more. Her knees throbbed from kneeling, and each movement sent waves of soreness into her ribs. As she worked, she saw Samuel again. He stood by the kitchen window, half hidden behind the curtain. His eyes watched her, wide and shimmering with a silent urgency. For a moment she imagined him stepping forward, saying something, anything. But he only pressed a hand against the glass, his small silhouette trembling. She lowered her gaze quickly, her fingers tightening around the rag. Mrs. Carter stepped down from the porch and moved past her, her boots scuffing softly in the dirt. Lila kept her head down, counting each thud of her heart, each scrape of the brush. Mrs. Carter paused by the cellar. Lila felt, rather than saw, her head turn toward the door. "You finish here," Mrs. Carter called, her voice drifting back over her shoulder. Then inside, Lila listened to her footsteps fade, the soft creak of the back door closing. When she finally dared to lift her eyes, she saw Samuel was gone from the window. Only the echo of his small, shaking hand against the glass remained in her mind. She pressed her forehead to the rough wood of the step, her breath catching in her throat. Samuel's note burned in her mind. "Don't let her take you to the cellar. No one returns." Lila squeezed her eyes shut. In that darkness she saw the cellar again, the swollen door, the waiting blackness, the final, silent fall of those who had come before her. But she also felt that new ember inside her, trembling but alive, the promise she had made to herself. Number. She held on to that word, her fingers curling tight around it like a weapon, as the last of the sun slipped below the horizon and the house began to settle into its long, dangerous night. Night fell like a heavy curtain, swallowing the last colors from the yard and leaving only pale moonlight and deep shifting shadows. Lila lay on her cot, her eyes open, her breath slow and shallow. She could hear Mrs. Carter moving through the hallway, her steps unhurried and certain, like a warden checking each lock before sleep. Lila's wrists throbbed where the rope had bitten into them. She turned them slowly under the blanket, feeling the raw skin catch against the coarse fabric. In her mind she replayed Samuel's warning over and over, the words clawing at her thoughts. "Don't let her take you to the cellar. No one returns." Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked open. A soft rustle followed, the sound of a long dress brushing against the floor. Lila tensed, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Then she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. The footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate. The handle on her door shifted, and before she could even stand, Mrs. Carter slipped into the room. The older woman's face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes sharp and gleaming. In one hand she held a length of thick rope. In the other, a small oil lantern that threw long, quivering shadows along the walls. "It's time," Mrs. Carter said softly, as though coaxing a wild animal. Lila's mouth went dry. She pushed back against the wall, her head shaking. Mrs. Carter stepped forward. "You knew this would come. You should be grateful I kept you this long." Lila's fingers searched blindly beneath her thin pillow, grasping for anything, and found it. A small, sharp shard of iron Samuel had slipped into her wash-basin days before. She hadn't dared to believe she might need it, until now. Mrs. Carter reached for her wrist. With a sudden cry that ripped from her throat like a wild animal's snarl, Lila swung the iron shard. It sliced across Mrs. Carter's forearm, a thin, dark line opening under the moonlight. Mrs. Carter let out a sharp hiss, more anger than pain. The rope slipped from her hand and fell to the floor with a dull thud. "Ungrateful little rat," she spat, lunging forward. Lila scrambled off the cot, her knees nearly buckling. She clutched the shard with both hands, her arms shaking violently. Mrs. Carter swung at her, fingers clawed. Lila ducked, feeling the sharp burn of nails scraping her cheek. She stumbled toward the door, her shoulder slamming into the frame so hard she saw stars. She twisted into the hallway, her bare feet slipping on the warped boards. Behind her, Mrs. Carter's steps thundered, the woman's breath coming in furious gasps. Lila bolted past the kitchen, past the basin where she'd washed Mrs. Carter's clothes, where she'd stolen quick glances at Samuel's sad, wide eyes. She crashed into the back door and nearly fell through it into the cold night. The yard opened before her, vast, empty, and pale under the moon. Her chest burned, each breath like knives in her ribs. She heard Mrs. Carter behind her, shrieking her name, the voice twisted and raw. Lila glanced to the side. The orchard. The broken path Samuel had shown her once with just his eyes. The path she had memorized without knowing she would ever have the courage to use it. She ran, the shard still clutched in her hand, her feet tearing open on stones and broken twigs. Behind her, Mrs. Carter's screams echoed into the orchard, fading as Lila slipped deeper into the dark. Branches clawed at her arms, her hair, her face, but she didn't stop. Somewhere deep in her mind, a voice rose above the chaos, fierce and trembling. "No one takes me. No one owns me." She didn't look back, not even once. Lila ran until her lungs felt like they might burst, until her vision blurred at the edges and her legs threatened to fold under her. Each breath tore through her throat, dry and sharp as broken glass. The orchard swallowed her, its crooked branches clawing at her dress, tearing long, frantic threads from the thin fabric. Leaves tangled in her hair, and thorns scraped thin lines of blood across her arms and cheeks. Behind her, the house was a distant shape, the moonlight glancing off its warped roof. Mrs. Carter's screams still rang faintly in the air, wild and jagged, but Lila no longer heard words, only a raw, animal howl that seemed to shudder through the trees. She pushed forward, ducking under low limbs, her feet stumbling over roots and stones. At one point she fell, her knees slamming into the dirt. For a heartbeat she lay there, her face pressed to the cold ground, the taste of blood in her mouth. A small voice in her mind hissed, "Stay down, give up, it's too far." But deeper than that, a different voice rose, smaller but sharper, bright as a blade. "Get up, keep moving." She forced her body upright, her arms shaking as she pushed herself forward again. She could feel the iron shard still clenched in her hand, sticky with her own blood and sweat. It felt heavier now, a part of her. She saw the edge of the orchard at last, the thin fence line, the pale dust trail beyond it shimmering under the moon. She staggered toward it, her whole body screaming for rest, for water, for air that didn't taste of fear. At the fence, she clawed at the old boards, shoving her weight against them until one post cracked and leaned just enough for her to slip through. Beyond it, the desert sprawled, an ocean of dust and low, thorny brush, its emptiness terrifying and beautiful at once. She hesitated, sucking in short, gasping breaths. She looked back one last time. The orchard looked almost peaceful now, still and silver under the moon, hiding the violence and shadows behind its quiet leaves. The house beyond it was a black silhouette, its windows dark, the cellar door unseen but pulsing in her memory like a wound. Lila turned away. She stepped forward, her feet sinking slightly into the soft dust. Each step felt like walking on splinters, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was still alive, still moving. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the land met the starlit sky in a thin, trembling line. Somewhere out there might be a town, a ranch, a single light in a window. Anything but that cellar. Wind whistled low across the desert, tugging at her hair, drying the sweat and blood on her skin. She stumbled forward, one hand pressed to her ribs, the other still gripping the shard. She no longer felt like the silent girl who had stepped off the wagon days ago. That girl had been hollow, bowed under the weight of fear and shame. Now, every torn nail, every scrape and bruise, every burning breath had carved something else into her, a thin, trembling shape of defiance. She didn't know if she would make it to help. She didn't know if tomorrow even existed beyond this moonlit night. But she knew one thing with a fierce, unshakable certainty. She would rather die on the open dust than live another hour beneath that roof. And so she kept walking into the cold, endless dark, step by fragile, unstoppable step. The desert night stretched around Lila like an endless ocean. Each step forward felt heavier, her breath burning in her throat, her feet raw and trembling. Her dress clung to her skin in torn strips, the thin fabric now a map of every branch and stone she had fought through. Above her, the stars gleamed in cruel silence. The moon, fat and pale, slid slowly across the sky, offering a cold kind of guidance. A distant promise that morning might come if she just kept moving. She paused by a low, spiny bush, sinking to her knees. Her entire body shuddered with exhaustion, each muscle quivering like an overwound clock about to snap. She pressed her forehead to the ground, tasting dust and salt as her tears soaked into the earth. She wanted to scream, but found no voice left in her throat, only a raw rasp that broke into nothing. In that hushed, empty dark, her mind drifted back to Samuel. His wide, frightened eyes, his trembling hands pressing the note into hers. "Don't let her take you to the cellar. No one returns." She clutched the shard of iron closer to her chest. Even now it felt warm, as if it carried the last spark of another human's courage. A sudden sound shivered through the stillness. The faint bray of a distant mule, the soft clang of metal. Lila's head snapped up, her heart thundering in her chest. She wiped her face with a shaking hand and listened. The wind shifted again, carrying more distant noises, A dog barking, a low voice calling out, faint and broken by the breeze. A settlement? She pulled herself to her feet, every joint screaming in protest. Her legs buckled once, but she gritted her teeth and forced them straight. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched to catch her if she fell again. Each step dragged her closer to that faint thread of sound, a fragile rope pulling her out of the abyss. After what felt like hours, she saw it, a small, low structure barely visible against the pale dust. A thin line of smoke curled from a metal chimney, wavering into the moonlit sky. Lila staggered toward it, her breaths short and harsh. As she neared, she saw a man standing by a corral, a lantern swinging gently in his hand. His face turned toward her, his mouth opening in surprise. She took 2 more steps, the ground tilting wildly beneath her. The iron shard slipped from her fingers, landing softly in the dirt. Her knees gave way. The man dropped the lantern and ran forward, his boots pounding against the hard ground. When he reached her, she collapsed fully, her body folding into itself. "Hey, girl, hold on now!" His voice sounded far away, muffled as though underwater. He knelt beside her, his strong hands bracing her shoulders. She felt his warmth, heard his frantic words. Her eyes fluttered open once more. In the distant haze, she saw the pale line of dawn breaking on the horizon. Soft, hesitant, but real. A sob rose in her chest, weak but alive. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing the man's sleeve. Her lips moved, but the words barely formed. "Please, no Cellar, no more." The man bent closer, his voice breaking with shock and urgency. "You're safe now. I got you. You're safe." She tried to focus on his face, but her vision smeared into streaks of color and light. Her body sagged against his, the last scraps of her strength dissolving into the cold morning air. Somewhere deep inside her, a tiny flame flickered. The knowledge that she had run, that she had fought, that she had chosen her own ending rather than the Cellar's silent grave. As the world finally slipped into darkness, she clung to that final, defiant truth. She was free. Lila floated in and out of consciousness, her mind like a half-lit hallway, where shapes drifted in and out of view. Voices ebbed and flowed above her, rough, urgent shouts, the soft crackle of a fire, the clink of metal. When she surfaced, she felt warmth on her face, sunlight, gentle and golden, so different from the sharp desert moonlight that had haunted her every step. She turned her head weakly. A coarse blanket lay draped over her shoulders, rough but comforting. Beneath her, a straw mattress smelled of dry grass and wood smoke. The walls around her were bare wood, uneven but solid. Through a small window, she saw a thin ribbon of blue sky and heard the quiet hum of morning chores, the scrape of a shovel, a horse snorting softly. A chair creaked nearby. She shifted her gaze and saw the man from the corral, older, with sun-leathered skin and a patchy gray beard. His eyes, though hard from years under the sun, held a steady kindness as he watched her. "Morning," he said quietly, tipping his hat back from his forehead. "You're safe here." Lila tried to speak, but her throat seized. Only a dry croak escaped. The man rose and crossed to a small table, returning with a tin cup. He knelt beside her and guided it carefully to her lips. "Slow," he murmured. "Just a sip at a time." The first swallow made her cough, but she forced it down. Water slipped down her raw throat, cold and impossibly clean. She took another sip, then another, until her hand trembled too badly to hold the cup. "Name's Elias," the man said. "This here's my line shack. I keep it stocked for herders who get caught out late." He paused, searching her face. "You ain't no herder, though. Where'd you come from, girl?" Lila's eyes darted to the window. For a moment she saw the orchard again, the twisted shapes of the trees, the cellar door gaping open like a wound. Her lips parted, a single word crawling up from deep inside her. Cellar? Elias stiffened, his jaw tightening. He set the cup aside, his weathered hands hovering near her shoulders as though he wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. "You ain't got to tell it all now," he said after a long moment. "We'll get you warm, get you food in your belly, then you can talk if you want." Tears blurred her vision, dripping into her hair. Lila clutched at the blanket, curling into it as though she might disappear inside its rough weave. Elias stood and moved to the door, glancing back at her before stepping out. "I'll fetch some broth," he called over his shoulder. "You just rest easy now. You made it. You hear me? You made it." Lila's body shook with silent sobs. She pressed her face into the pillow, her breath ragged. In her mind, she saw Samuel's eyes one last time, wide and shining, with a fear she now understood completely. She pictured the cellar door and the quiet horror it guarded. But beneath the terror and grief, a thin thread of relief pulsed, slow and steady. She had crossed the fence. She had run. She was here. Outside, a breeze stirred, lifting the edge of the curtain. Sunlight pooled across her blanket, warm on her battered skin. Lila closed her eyes, her fingers twisting into the rough fabric as though anchoring herself to the world she had almost lost. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to believe the word she had barely dared to speak. Safe. The broth steamed in a chipped enamel bowl, its scent filling the small shack with warmth and something like comfort. Lila sat propped against the wall, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, but she forced it to her lips, tasting salt and herbs. Elias sat nearby on a low stool, elbows resting on his knees. He watched her eat, his eyes alert but gentle, like he was guarding a wounded animal that might bolt at any second. "Slow now," he said quietly when she coughed. "Ain't no hurry." Lila nodded, though her throat still felt raw, each swallow a small battle. But she kept going, one careful spoonful at a time. When the bowl was nearly empty, she lowered it into her lap, her eyes drifting to the dirt floor. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Elias shifted forward. "You want to tell me who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Lila's fingers curled tighter around the bowl. Her lips parted, but the words seemed caught behind her teeth. Elias waited, patient as a stone. She drew a shaky breath. "A woman, Mrs. Carter," she whispered. The name tasted like poison in her mouth. She kept me. There was a cellar, others before me. Her voice broke. Her fingers tightened so hard around the bowl that it clinked against the spoon. Elias reached out slowly, taking the bowl from her hands and setting it aside. "It's all right," he said. "You don't gotta say it all at once." Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in thin, salty lines. Her shoulders shook with the force of them. Elias hesitated only a moment before moving to sit beside her. His hand, rough and warm, settled carefully on her back. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "Whatever she did, she can't reach you here," he said, his voice steady as the desert itself. "Ain't no cellar here, ain't no locks. You're free now." Lila pressed her forehead into her knees, sobs tearing through her thin frame. The words felt impossible to believe, yet hearing them cracked something deep inside her, like a window letting in light after years of darkness. Elias stayed beside her, his hand firm and steady. He didn't try to hush her or ask more questions. He just sat, breathing slowly, anchoring her to the present moment. When her sobs finally subsided, she raised her head. Her eyes were swollen and red, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Elias offered her a rag. She took it, wiping her cheeks and nose, her hands still trembling. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. He nodded. "You're safe, girl. We'll get word to town. Folks there don't take kindly to people like her. We'll see she don't hurt no one else." Lila's breath caught. The thought of Mrs. Carter locked away, or driven out, powerless, felt unreal, too bright to imagine. She looked out the small window beside her. Beyond the dusty glass, the sky stretched endless and pale, the horizon trembling with heat and the first hints of freedom. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the wall, the rough wood solid behind her. Somewhere inside her, a small, fragile warmth flickered, a timid, newborn thing, but alive. For the first time since she stepped off the wagon, she let herself feel it. The possibility of a life beyond the cellar, beyond the yard, beyond Mrs. Carter's cold hands. A life she might claim as her own. The next morning dawned soft and pale, the sun rising slowly over the dusty horizon. Lila stirred on the straw mattress, her eyes blinking open to the hush of early chores outside, the low murmur of Elias talking to his mule, the clink of a pail against the water trough. She pushed herself up, her body heavy and sore, but no longer shaking with terror. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the quiet air settle in her lungs without the sharp bite of fear that had followed her for so long. The door creaked open. Elias stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused when he saw her sitting up, and a small, gentle smile softened the deep lines around his mouth. "Morning," he said. "You're looking steadier today." Lila managed a small nod. "Morning." Her voice was rough, but it held. Elias crossed to the small table and set down a tin mug of warm water and a piece of flatbread wrapped in cloth. "Eat what you can. No rush." She took the mug with both hands, sipping carefully. The warmth spread through her chest, easing the last shivers from her bones. Elias settled onto his stool, studying her with quiet patience. "Once you feel strong enough," he said, "I can take you into town. There's a dock there and folks who'll look out for you. You can stay here a few days first if you want, no one pushing you." Lila lowered the mug, her eyes drifting to the doorway and the bright sliver of open sky beyond it. "Town," she whispered, almost to herself. The word felt heavy with both fear and wonder. A door she hadn't dared imagine before. Elias nodded slowly. "That's right, a proper town, fresh bread, clean beds, folks who know how to help." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "And she won't follow?" A flash of steel crossed Elias's eyes. "She won't. I'll see to that myself if I have to. You have my word." Lila swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on a small knot in the wood floor. The image of the orchard, the cellar door, the dark hallway clawed at her mind, but she pushed it back, her breath coming steadier with each passing moment. "I think I want to go," she said finally. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I want to leave it all behind." Elias let out a slow breath, nodding again. "That's good, girl. That's real good." They sat in silence for a long while. Lila ate the bread in small bites, each chew grounding her in the moment. Outside, the breeze rustled through the dry brush, carrying the scent of sage and warm earth into the room. When she finished, Elias stood and offered his hand. She hesitated only a second before slipping her fingers into his rough palm. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when her legs wobbled. For the first time, she didn't flinch from his touch. She took a careful step forward, then another, each one echoing through her mind as a quiet declaration. "I survived. I'm still here." At the doorway, she paused, turning her face into the sunlight. The warmth slid across her skin, and her eyes stung with sudden tears. Elias stood beside her, his hand still hovering near her shoulder in case she faltered. "Ready?" he asked. Lila drew in a deep, shuddering breath. A small, fragile spark of something like hope flickered in her chest. "Yes," she said, and together they stepped into the morning, toward the unknown, toward something beyond fences and cellar doors, toward a life she could finally begin to claim as her own. The wagon rolled slowly along the dusty road, each turn of its wheels stirring small spirals of pale dirt that drifted behind them like faint ghosts. Lila sat beside Elias, her hands resting on her lap, fingers wrapped loosely around the edge of her borrowed shawl. The sun was climbing higher now, warming her shoulders through the thin fabric. She turned her face into the breeze, letting it tug gently at her hair. Each breath tasted of sage and dry grass, but beneath it she thought she could already sense the coming scent of fresh bread and wood smoke from the town ahead. Elias glanced over at her occasionally, checking her posture, her eyes. Each time she met his gaze, she managed a small, hesitant nod, and he would return it with a quiet, approving grunt. They passed a broken fence line, the posts leaning and half swallowed by weeds. Lila's eyes lingered on it, a memory echoing behind her ribs, a fence she had once thought impossible to cross. She tightened her fingers in her lap, feeling the tiny scabs on her wrists catch against the fabric. Pain still flickered there, but it no longer ruled her every thought. Instead, each heartbeat felt like a soft, cautious knock on a new door. At a curve in the road, they crested a low rise. Beyond it, she saw the first outlines of the town, a cluster of low buildings, a few thin curls of chimney smoke, the faint sound of a dog barking somewhere unseen. Lila sucked in a sharp breath. Her shoulders tensed as though expecting a hand to yank her backward, but none came. Elias slowed the wagon. "We'll stop by the doctor first," he said, his voice careful but firm. "Then we'll find you a place to rest. Folks here, they'll help you start over. You won't have to tell them everything at once." She nodded, her throat tightening. As they drew closer, she began to make out shapes in the street. A woman sweeping a porch, a man unloading sacks from a cart, a boy chasing a stray chicken. Ordinary life, alive and moving, untouched by the cellar's dark silence. When the wagon finally stopped, Elias climbed down first, turning to offer his hand. Lila stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a small, shaking breath, she reached forward and took it. He helped her down gently. Her boots touched solid ground, and for a moment she just stood there, her fingers still curled around his. She looked up at the dusty street ahead, the open windows, the smell of bread and horses and morning. Inside her chest she felt a trembling warmth spread, fragile but real, like a small seed breaking open under the sun. She let go of Elias's hand and took a step forward on her own, then another. Each movement felt impossible and miraculous all at once. Behind her, Elias watched, his hands resting on his belt, a quiet pride softening his hard-set features. Lila paused halfway across the street, turning her face into the wind. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her, the smells and sounds of freedom pressing against her skin. She opened her eyes again and took another step, and in that moment, for the first time in all the silent, bruised nights, in all the dark hallways and cellar echoes, she felt it fully. She had chosen this road, this breath, this life. Whatever came next, it would be hers. The cellar door was behind her now. Ahead, the world waited, wide, rough, unpromising, but open. She stepped forward again, and with each small, shaking step, she began, finally, to live.